So my name is Varsha. I'm a machine learning engineer at MindMeld Cisco. So at MindMeld, we work on conversational AI agents. And one of the things we work on is WebEx Assistant, which is an assistant for all your meeting collaboration use cases. So usually when I say conversational assistant, the first thing you think of is like a human and a bot interacting with each other. But there may be many other things that a virtual assistant needs to do for you. So an example in the case of WebEx Assistant could be during the meeting, the assistant needs to take down notes for you. And that brings us to the use case that we're going to talk about today, which is meeting highlights. So how we define this is like capturing the extractive summary of a meeting. But as you may know, that is a very difficult problem, both in terms of collecting annotations for this task, as well as evaluating your system for this task. So the main concern is the subjectivity. So if you give two annotators the same set of meetings and ask them to annotate what are the key pieces of information that you want to take away from this meeting, they usually don't have very good agreement between them. And also, if you get third-party annotators annotate a meeting, and then you get in-meeting participants annotate that meeting for you to get the highlights, you see that there is a very low overlap between what in-meeting participants think are takeaways from a meeting versus a third-party annotator. So this makes it really difficult to collect like large data sets. And especially given that we've seen so much success in summarizing news content because of like the large data sets that we have to train models on, this problem, transferring those sort of learnings to this problem becomes difficult. So if people can't agree on what the key takeaways from a meeting are, is there anything they agree on at all? So we did a survey with around 40 participants who come from different job titles and roles, and asked them to describe what, according to them, are key takeaways from a meeting. So the one thing that stood out is all of them agreed on action items. They all wanted to know what are some of the actionable things that they can work on after the meeting. And so we decided to restructure our problem now to, instead of capturing the extractive summary of a meeting, let's try to capture all the actionable items that happen within a meeting. So in order to formulate this problem more, what I mean by actionable items in a meeting is, let's just look at a bunch of examples. So during the course of the meeting, you said something like, I'll schedule another meeting, or the main priorities for me are to work on this thing this week, or you're asking someone in the meeting if they can follow up with someone else and give you an update. So these are all sort of some examples of the things you want to capture. So okay, that looks great. But to move on with this, we need to formalize sort of these key pieces of information that we want to identify so that we can get them annotated. Fortunately for us, such a framework already exists that sort of puts into boxes these kind of this kind of information that we want to gather, and that's where speech acts or dialogue acts come in. So what a speech act is it captures the intention of a speaker, and by this intent, what we mean is like a shallow understanding and of what the user means, and it's mostly very general. So these intents are not the same as what we see in traditional dialogue systems. So in a traditional dialogue system, when you say, how can I turn on the video, or what's the weather today, they mostly belong to two different intents. The weather will belong to the weather intent, and the other one may belong to the help intent. But they both belong to the same speech act category, which is a question. And depending on your application, maybe you want to further refine the speech act tag into like a rhetorical question, or a yes/no question, or a what, why, who, where, how type of question. So that brings us to the next point, which is there are many different taxonomies that are available in literature for speech acts or dialogue acts. And so depending on your domain, you can decide which subset of these tags you want to use. So how do we define our taxonomy for this? So as we discussed earlier, there are basically like two broad categories of things that we want to identify. One is things that you promise to do over the course of the meeting. So we're going to call these commitments. And the other thing is when somebody's asking you to do something in a meeting. So we call them directives. And in addition to them, we use some other tags like, say, acknowledgement, because you want to know if somebody acknowledged a directive, for example. And we also have another tag called elaboration. So what we mean by that is when the speaker adds some extra information to either a commitment or a directive, we would like to try and capture that as well. Okay, that's great. So here are some examples of what a directive and a commitment could be given our taxonomy. So there's a problem here. So when somebody says in a meeting, can you sync up offline on this issue? Okay, that's something we probably want to highlight on because it's an actionable item. Whereas as soon as you join the meeting, you're just testing your microphone and you're saying, can you all, that's probably, it's a directive, but that's probably not something you want to highlight. Similarly for the commitments as well. When you say, let me share my screen now, which is how most presentations begin, that is a commitment that the speaker is doing, but it's not really important as a highlight. Whereas when they say, I'm going to merge in my code soon or something like that, maybe that's a commitment that you want to capture. So how do we handle these differences given our taxonomy? So we define two subtags for the main tag, depending on the scope of actions. So from the previous case, when you say, can you hear me, or let me share my screen, the scope of these actions are limited to the duration of the meeting, and they're completed within the meeting. Whereas things like, I'm going to merge my code, or can you sync up offline, these are basically actions that need to happen after the meeting. So we have two subcategories called in-meeting commitments and directives and post-meeting commitments and directives. So by doing this subclassification, we can now focus on just showing the user the post-meeting commitments and directives as highlights. So in terms of methods, there are multiple different models that you can sort of explore for this task, but to build a POC, we had a small set of 100 meetings annotated for these speech act tags, so which gave us around 51,000 sentences to train on. And I call them noisy annotations because we have only one annotator per meeting. And we don't do any sort of agreement or verification of these tags. So what worked best for us is using these large-scale transformer models and fine-tuning them on our classification task, which gave us fairly good accuracies. But you can definitely check up on literature that has different models for these tasks for different applications. And also another area where you can experiment is what is the context window that you're allowing your classifiers to see. So given that you want to classify sentence I, you could potentially also give the classifier information of a few sentences before sentence I and a few sentences after, so that it gets a better sense of what the current sentence you're trying to classify is actually informing. So yeah, coming to the second challenge of the task of meeting highlights, which is the evaluation itself. So we did two sets of evaluation. One is we gave 12 meetings to third-party annotators and asked them, okay, so what do you think are the key highlights of this meeting? And when I say third-party annotators, I should mention that these are expert annotators. who also work in the same domain, so they have some domain knowledge. It's just that they were not participants in that meeting. So when you evaluate the extractive summary that your system has now generated, which mostly contains actionable items, you see that with the third-party annotators, we have a high precision, which means most of the things that we thought are important takeaways were actually important takeaways. But we see that our recall is like lower than 50%, which means we still have a lot of ground to cover in terms of other key pieces of information in the meeting that we seem to have missed out on. But on the flip side, when we ask the in-meeting participants, meaning participants who are actually part of the meeting, to also give their annotations for the highlights in real time, we saw that our precision was now like 55%, and our recall went further down to 33, which sort of brings this interesting problem of like, is it because it was happening in real time and participants are more sort of aware of the conversation going on, so they're more likely to mark fewer things as highlights? Would these in-meeting participants have marked annotated highlights differently if it happened in a post-meeting setting, and so on? So there are a lot of challenges in the evaluation of this task as well. So in terms of this concept of speech act itself, this has been around for a long time now, and it's you can find a lot of literature around speech acts themselves, and they have many other applications. So one of the most useful ones is to improve downstream NLU accuracies in conversational agents, as well as it provides you some other information that you can use to do efficient dialogue management. You can also use a modified taxonomy of what I just presented for extracting actionable items and then apply it to like a chat message setting in an organization so that when you're committing to do something, that gets added to some sort of a to-do list and so on. And you can also use these speech acts to gain insight into like call center conversations, just so you can analyze how the interaction between an agent and a customer is going on. So maybe you can identify some key things that are working for you or are not working for you. And an interesting application of this that came out recently in academia is to identify when a sentence is polite or not, and then use that tag to sort of do a style transfer and make that impolite sentence into actually a polite sentence. So that was sort of an interesting application. So just to dive a bit more in what I mean by how this can be used for efficient dialogue management. So let's say you have a conversational agent that's sort of helping a customer to buy clothes. So this is sort of a typical interaction that can happen where the user says, hi, and you ask the user, what can I help you with? And the user asks for, I don't know, maybe sweaters in medium for women. And the bot responds with, sure, here's the top selling sweater from such and such a brand. And when the user responds to it saying, I don't like that brand, the question is, what do you do then? So the first few turns of interaction were pretty simple, where you knew the intent was greet and you didn't have any slots there. In the second case, you knew the user is trying to find a product and these are the slots there. But when the user says, I don't like that brand, there are sort of many different ways you could go, and it's not really clear like which intent that it should actually belong to. Typically, in such scenarios, you would maybe respond to the user with a reprompt saying, yeah, I didn't quite understand what you said. Would you like me to show you more products or something like that? But if we had this extra information of what speech acts each of the user turns belong to, then maybe we could handle this better. So in this case, the first one, is a greeting. The second one, is a question. And the third one, is an opinion. And once we know that it's an opinion, you could also use some sort of sentiment analyzer to know what the sentiment of that opinion is. And now you know that this was a negative opinion. So given this information, then it could match to a show more intent, where you want to show more things from the products that you retrieved. But in addition, you could also identify a plot that you want to filter on. And because we know that this is a negative opinion, you know that you want to remove all the retrieved sweaters from that particular brand. And this could basically enhance user experience and make the bot sound more intelligent. So yeah, those were some of the examples where speech acts could be applicable. I've listed some resources here that could be very useful for you if you're interested in learning more about speech acts and its applications. There are a bunch of data sets that are widely used in the community. The switchboard dialog at Corpus contains around 1,000 odd conversations between humans that are labeled with around 40 different speech act tags that could be useful. The similar set of tags have been used to also do this task that we talked about today, which is identifying actionable items in meetings. And there is a small data set of meeting recordings that have been annotated for these tags. And to know more about how these are used for task-oriented dialogues, here's this recent paper that talks about how you can use dialog acts for tagging. So yeah, that's all I had for today. Hopefully I was on time.